The sun beat down relentlessly over the wide open plains, casting an orange glow across the arid landscape. The ranch, once a thriving hub of activity, now stood silent and parched, with cracked earth beneath the hooves of cattle that wandered aimlessly. The dry season had gripped the land for months, turning the pastures to dust, and with it, the tensions of the ranches began to rise. Emma, a small, brown-eyed orphan, worked alongside rancher James Cartwright, a gruff man in his 40s with weathered skin and a face that had seen too many hard years. Despite her age, Emma had become more than just a helper. She'd been raised by the ranch, her resilience growing stronger with each passing day after the tragic loss of her parents in a farm accident. Emma's hands were rough, much like the hands of anyone who worked the land. Her dirty dress clung to her small frame as she moved swiftly, doing chores, feeding the chickens and helping Cartwright manage the cattle. James, though cold and distant at first, had come to depend on her, trusting her to handle some of the tougher tasks around the ranch. Today, like any other, the land stretched endlessly before them, yet something felt different. The air was thick, and the wind seemed to carry more than just the usual dust. It carried the scent of danger. Emma could feel it too. The sun was high in the sky when the whisper of the wind picked up, a gust of air that seemed out of place. Then, far off in the distance, Emma spotted it, the telltale puff of smoke curling into the air like a dark omen. A fire, started by the dry grass, began to creep across the far end of the pasture, too fast for anyone to contain. James Cartwright cursed under his breath, his weathered face a mask of urgency and frustration. The wind was picking up, the flames already licking the edges of the field. Cattle, panicked and disoriented, were running toward the fire's edge, trapped by their own confusion. "Emma, get to town!" Cartwright barked, his voice rough as he began to herd the cattle in the opposite direction. He was trying to control the chaos, but the fire was too close, the wind too strong. Emma froze, her heart racing in her chest. The fire wasn't far off now. The smoke clouded her vision, and the flames flickered in the distance, threatening to destroy everything in its path. Her eyes widened, the weight of the situation crashing down on her like the heat from the fire. She knew there wasn't enough time for a trip into town. The danger was too imminent. As Cartwright's voice faded behind her, Emma felt the panic rise in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, cold determination. There was no time to wait for help. She had to act. She looked back at the ranch, the cows, the barn and the pasture, her home. The fire was growing, and the cattle were running in the wrong direction, right toward the blaze. Emma's legs moved on their own as she rushed toward the herd, her small hands grasping at whatever tools she could find, fingers trembling with adrenaline. Then it clicked in her mind, a wet blanket. She could use it to beat back the flames, maybe slow the fire before it spread. Grabbing the blanket from the nearby barn, she wrapped it around her shoulders and ran toward the nearest cluster of cattle, trying to steer them away from the fire's grip. Her breath came in gasps, the heat making her skin burn as she sprinted. The cattle were confused, their eyes wide with terror, but Emma's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. With each step, the fire grew closer, the ground beneath her feet crackling with heat. Emma pushed the herd forward, beating at the edge of the fire with the wet blanket. It was a desperate act, an act of bravery that defied logic. The flames danced wildly around her, but she didn't back down. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. The blaze couldn't win. She wouldn't let it. Emma's determination burned brighter than the fire itself, and as she steered the cattle toward the river, she could feel something shift deep inside her. This was her moment. She had to save the herd, the ranch, and the legacy of everything it stood for. The fire continued to rage, its crackling roar filling the air and drowning out everything else. Emma's heart raced as she saw the flames climbing higher, licking the dry grass and sending embers dancing in the wind. The thick smoke made her eyes sting and her breathing shallow. She had never seen a fire this fierce, but there was no time to hesitate. Her body moved on instinct, adrenaline surging through her veins. Rancher Cartwright's shouts were muffled by the roar of the flames, but she could see his frustration. The cattle were scattered, running in every direction, trapped by their fear. Emma felt the weight of the situation, realizing that the fire was advancing too fast for anyone to stop it in time. She was alone with the herd now. If she didn't act, they would all be lost. Her small hands gripped the wet blanket tighter as she scanned the chaos. The cattle were panicking, darting toward the flames in blind fear. Emma's pulse quickened as she noticed the most vulnerable animals, the older cows, the calves, those that had wandered too far from the main herd. They were headed straight for the fire, drawn by confusion and the deafening noise of the blaze. For a moment her breath caught in her throat. There was no way to stop it, no one else to help. The enormity of the task hit her. This wasn't just a fire. This was her chance to save the ranch. She had no choice. Without a second thought, Emma bolted into action, weaving between the panicked cattle with her legs moving faster than she had ever run before. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her mind was clear. The path was narrow, the fire licking at her heels, but she didn't stop. Shouting loudly, her voice cutting through the air, she commanded the herd, directing them away from the inferno. She wasn't just running beside them, she was taking charge, guiding them with a fierce intensity that spoke of the bond she had developed with the animals. "This way!" she yelled as she pushed her small frame between them, her hands waving the blanket in the air. The cattle seemed to understand. They followed her at first hesitantly, then with more urgency as Emma ran ahead. Her small voice, hoarse from the smoke, was the only thing cutting through the noise of the fire. Emma felt her legs burning with exhaustion, her chest tight with the effort, but she pressed on, determined. She had to get them to the river. Her mind raced, calculating the quickest path, scanning the fields for any signs of danger that might hinder their progress. The fire was creeping closer, but the cool promise of the river lay just ahead. She knew it was their only chance. As the herd followed her, Emma's heart swelled with pride. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but she felt something else now. Confidence. She could do this. She had done it before, helping Cartwright with the cattle, learning the land, understanding the rhythms of the ranch. She was more than just a helper now. She was their leader, their guide in this moment of terror. Her bond with the animals was deeper than any of them realized, and it was in this moment of danger that Emma fully understood the power of that connection. The cattle's panicked movements began to slow as they followed her lead, their hooves pounding against the dry earth as they ran toward safety. Emma's legs burned and the sweat poured down her face, but her steps were steady. Her mind stayed focused, never wavering, always looking ahead to the river that was fast approaching. The flames were now a roaring wall of heat behind them, but Emma didn't falter. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she never stopped running, urging the herd forward. With each step, the flames receded into the distance, the blazing inferno now a far-off memory that was losing its hold on the land. As they neared the river, Emma's heart surged with relief. She could see it now, the water, glistening in the sunlight, a wide stretch of cool, flowing relief. The cattle were slowing down, the terror beginning to subside. They were close enough to be safe, and Emma, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had led them to safety. But as the herd neared the water, Emma's legs gave way beneath her, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. She stumbled, falling to the ground, her hands still clutching the blanket as her eyes flicked over the cattle, alive, safe, and out of danger. In that moment, as the river's cool waters lapped at her feet, Emma realized that her bravery had changed everything. She had acted without hesitation, thinking only of the animals and their safety. But in doing so, she had proven something to herself. The ranch, this land, and these creatures were hers too. She wasn't just an orphan anymore. She was part of something bigger. Emma's bravery had not only saved the herd, it had marked her as someone who could lead, someone who could be relied upon. The fire was still burning in the distance, but it was no longer a threat to her. Emma had taken control of the situation and in doing so had secured her place in the world of the ranch. The fire's speed was something Rancher Cartwright had never seen before. The wind carried the flames in every direction, and what had started as a small patch of fire had become a raging inferno in mere minutes. His heart raced, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. His livelihood, his cattle, the very essence of his ranch, was in immediate danger. He shouted orders to his hands, but they were struggling to keep the cattle contained. The flames were closing in, and the sky above him was thick with smoke. His thoughts scrambled as he tried to take control, but the heat was unbearable, and the fire was spreading too fast. His breath was ragged, and for the first time in a long time, Cartwright felt utterly powerless. His years of experience seemed insignificant against the relentless march of the flames. As the fire roared on, Rancher Cartwright's thoughts turned to the ranch itself, the barn, the fields, and the cattle. The loss would be catastrophic, but in the midst of this disaster, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Emma, small and determined, guiding the herd away from the flames. His mind spun as he watched her, a young orphan girl, practically leading the cattle with a courage that matched any seasoned rancher. She was standing right in the face of danger, running between the animals, shouting commands and keeping them moving in the right direction. Her small frame was a blur of determination, and for a moment, Cartwright forgot about the fire altogether, his focus solely on the girl who was doing the impossible. Cartwright's thoughts conflicted. On one hand, he had to make sure the cattle made it to safety, but on the other, he was stunned by Emma's bravery. Her determination to protect the animals was unlike anything he'd ever seen. His chest tightened, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over him. Without thinking, Cartwright ran toward Emma. He could see that the cattle were getting closer to the river, but there were still stragglers caught in the tangle of panicked movement. He called out to her, trying to help guide them, but Emma was already ahead, pushing the herd with a single-minded focus that was beyond her years. He had always seen her as the orphan girl who helped around the ranch, but now, seeing her in action, he realized she was much more than that. His heart pounded as he helped her guide the cattle through the river, the water rising around them as they moved deeper into the safety of the cool stream. The fire was still raging behind them, but they were making progress. Emma was a blur of action, never once faltering in her resolve, her small hands steady on the cattle, her voice loud and clear. It was as if she had become one with the herd, leading them through the river without hesitation. Cartwright, though older and stronger, was following her lead. They were a team now, Emma's courage pushing him to do more than he thought possible. The journey to the river wasn't without its losses. As they moved through the water, some cattle were too slow, and the fire was too close. Cartwright's heart sank as one of his favorite bulls went down in the flames, but there was no time to mourn. The fire was relentless, and they had to keep moving. Emma's eyes never wavered from the task at hand. She didn't cry out for the lost cattle. She didn't falter. She simply kept the others moving, urging them forward with everything she had. The fire raged on, but they had saved the majority. Some of the land would be lost, but the most important thing was the herd. Emma had done it. She had helped him save it. As the cattle reached the other side of the river, Cartwright looked at Emma in a way he hadn't before. Her face, covered in soot and sweat, glistened with determination. She was breathing heavily, but her eyes sparkled with something he couldn't name. In the midst of the fire's chaos, Emma had become the one thing he needed most, someone to rely on. Her bravery was no longer something that surprised him. It was something that demanded respect. She had stepped into the role of a leader, and in that moment, Cartwright saw her differently, not as the orphan girl working at his ranch, but as a young woman with a heart as strong as any rancher. When the fire finally began to die down, and the cattle were settled in a safe part of the pasture, Cartwright stood there for a long moment, reflecting on the day's events. His emotions were a tangled mess of exhaustion, pride, and admiration. He had always thought he could handle anything the land threw at him, but today Emma had done more than anyone else could. She had stepped up when the ranch needed her most. Her bravery had been the one thing that saved the herd, the one thing that had made all the difference. He couldn't deny it anymore. He respected her in ways he hadn't thought possible. As Cartwright looked over at Emma, watching her as she stood next to the cattle, he realized something profound. The ranch had always been his life, but Emma had just become a part of it in a way that changed everything. Their bond had deepened today, and it was no longer just about a man and his ranch. It was about a father-daughter-like relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The fire had tested them both, but through it they had found something stronger, a partnership that would define the future of the ranch. For the first time in years, Cartwright felt hope for the future. The fire had raged through the fields, but with Emma's bravery and the combined effort of the ranchers, the damage was finally under control. The air was thick with smoke, the horizon blurred by the haze, but the worst was over. As the townspeople emerged from their homes, the news began to spread like wildfire. Emma had saved the rancher's cattle, standing face to face with the flames and guiding the herd to safety. The once skeptical community, which had regarded her as little more than a pity case, now spoke her name with reverence. The young orphan, whom they had barely noticed before, was now the subject of every conversation in town. Whispers turned into full-blown discussions. At the town square, groups of men and women huddled, their eyes wide with disbelief as they recounted the story of what had happened. Some couldn't believe it at first. Emma, such a small girl, standing against the fire. It seemed impossible, but the town's collective shock gave way to awe. They began to realize that Emma's bravery had not only saved the cattle, but had also preserved the livelihood of the ranch, and in turn, the lifeblood of the entire town. The realization spread slowly but surely. The orphan had become a hero. By the time Emma walked into the town saloon later that evening, the whispers had already become loud discussions. The saloon, usually filled with the chatter of ranchers and cowhands, was now full of people looking to catch a glimpse of the girl who had defied the flames. The heavy oak door creaked open, and all eyes turned toward her. Emma's face flushed with discomfort, not used to being the center of attention. She was just a young girl trying to survive, but the looks she received were different now: admiration, awe, and respect. No longer the orphan, she was now a symbol of courage. Old ranchers and cowhands who had seen their fair share of fires and cattle losses gathered in a corner of the saloon, nodding in agreement as they shared their stories of survival. "She'd done what no one could have done," one rancher said, his voice rough with years of hard living. "Guided the whole herd through that fire like it was nothing. I seen men twice her size crumble under pressure, but that little one, she stood her ground." Others chimed in, each adding their own word of praise, while some remained skeptical, wondering if Emma's actions had truly been so extraordinary. The majority were in awe of her courage. As the discussions grew louder, the people began to realize something else. Emma wasn't just a helper anymore. Her actions had changed the way they saw her. The orphan, once seen as nothing more than a young girl, was now a figure who had made a lasting impact on their lives. The ranchers, who had once only seen her as Cartwright's assistant, now saw her as a woman of strength and determination. In the weeks to come, they would refer to her not just as Emma, but as a local hero, a figure who had changed the course of history for the town. At the bar, Bart, the saloon owner, poured drinks and nodded his approval, but a somber look crossed his face. While everyone around him was celebrating, he knew the reality of the land. The ranch was barely saved, the fire had scarred the land, and the town's future was still uncertain. Emma had given the town hope, but the lingering question remained. What if the fire returned? What if the ranch didn't recover? As the townsfolk laughed and talked, Bart's thoughts were still on the dangers ahead. Yet the glimmer of respect for Emma's courage was undeniable. She had, for now, become the embodiment of what the town needed: hope. Emma, on the other hand, felt something stirring inside her, something she had never felt before. As the saloon buzzed around her, she realized she was no longer the outcast. She wasn't just the girl who worked on the ranch anymore. She was a part of the town. The people were speaking her name with respect, not pity. As she glanced around the room, the weight of her newfound place in the community sank in. The townsfolk were now looking at her with admiration, as if they had seen something in her that she hadn't even fully realized herself. But as the evening wore on, Emma couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling that the fire could return, and everything she had worked for could still be lost. Though Emma basked in the warmth of the town's admiration, there was a lingering fear in the back of her mind. What if this was just the beginning of more challenges? The ranch was still scarred, and the future of the town remained uncertain. She had saved the cattle, but would she be able to save the ranch? Would the town ever truly accept her, or would they always see her as the orphan who had been lucky? These thoughts haunted her as she left the saloon, the cheers of the townspeople ringing in her ears. For now, she was their hero, but Emma knew the real challenge was yet to come. The aftermath of the fire had left the ranch in ruins. What had once been vast green pastures now lay in a sea of blackened earth. The fire had ravaged the land, scorching the soil and killing some of the cattle. Rancher Cartwright stood at the edge of the burnt fields, his eyes scanning the damage with a sober realization. The loss of livestock was devastating, but the damage to the land was even worse. Without healthy pastures, there would be no future for the herd. Even with Emma's courageous efforts, the recovery would be slow, perhaps too slow for the ranch to survive. Cartwright's fingers tightened around his hat as he stared into the distance, the weight of the challenge ahead pressing down on him. Despite his growing concern, Cartwright was grateful for Emma's bravery, yet the reality of their situation was unavoidable. The fire had taken more than just cattle, it had taken a piece of the ranch's soul. Emma could see the toll it was taking on him, the burden of loss visible in his eyes. But despite the enormity of the damage, she couldn't stand by and watch the ranch slip further into despair. She had seen the fire's destruction, but she also saw an opportunity to rebuild. As they walked along the charred remains of the land, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope rising within her. With a resolve that belied her age, Emma turned to Cartwright, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. "We can rebuild the pasture, Mr. Cartwright," she said, her hands balled into fists. "We'll need help from the town. They'll pitch in if we ask." It was a simple yet powerful suggestion, and for the first time since the fire had started, Cartwright looked at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. Emma's mind was already working, formulating plans to get the ranch back on its feet, but she didn't stop there. "If we trade some of the herd," she continued, "we can buy seeds to restore the farm. We can grow new crops, rebuild the pastures." Her words rang with a quiet strength, and for a moment Cartwright was speechless. Emma's resilience shone through her proposal. She wasn't simply reacting to the disaster, she was actively shaping the future of the ranch. It was a plan that demonstrated not only her problem-solving skills, but also her leadership abilities. She had no experience with business or trade, but she knew enough to understand that action was the only way out of their predicament. She was still just a young girl, but in that moment, her determination had all the maturity of a seasoned rancher. Cartwright looked at her, his expression unreadable. She wasn't the same girl who had come to work on the ranch a year ago. She had become something more, something essential to the ranch's survival. Despite Emma's brave suggestions, a nagging feeling of inadequacy crept into her chest. She had always been a fighter, but as she looked around at the damage, doubt began to cloud her thoughts. Was this enough? Was she enough to save the ranch? Her courage had saved the cattle, but what about the future? Had her efforts been enough, or had she simply bought them a little more time before the inevitable collapse? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the charred landscape, Emma's confidence wavered. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them to her sides, unsure of what to do next. Cartwright, Ever the stoic rancher noticed the shift in Emma's demeanor. He could see the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had given everything in the past few days, yet she still wondered if it was enough. His gruff voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "You've done more than enough, Emma," he said, his eyes meeting hers with quiet understanding. "You've given us a chance, more than we would have had without you. The fire's just a setback. The town will rally behind us." His words weren't just reassurance, they were a promise. The community had seen what Emma had done, and they would not let her efforts go to waste. Together, they would rebuild. As Emma listened to Cartwright's words, the tightness in her chest loosened slightly. For the first time since the fire, she felt like the weight on her shoulders might not be entirely hers to bear. She had done everything she could, and now, the rancher was telling her that it wasn't her responsibility alone to carry the ranch back to life. The town would support them. Her efforts had made the difference, but it was the collective strength of the community that would give the ranch a fighting chance. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for the future, for the ranch, and for the people she had come to call family. Still, as the night settled in and the wind picked up, Emma couldn't fully shake the feeling of unease. The ranch was far from being out of danger, and there were many challenges still ahead. The road to recovery would be long and difficult, and there were no guarantees. But as Emma looked at Cartwright, standing beside her in the growing darkness, she felt a quiet reassurance. She wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they would rebuild, not just the land, but the hope that had been almost lost in the flames. The future of the ranch, of her home, was still uncertain, but for the first time, Emma knew they had a real chance. The days following the fire were filled with uncertainty, but the town's response to Emma's bravery was nothing short of remarkable. Word had spread quickly about how she had single-handedly saved the cattle, and the respect for the young girl grew by the hour. In the days after the fire, the townspeople came together as they hadn't in years. The blacksmith, whose forge had been silent for days, was the first to offer his help, bringing his tools and strength to assist in rebuilding the damaged fences. Farmers from the surrounding area brought their wagons full of supplies, seeds, fertilizer, and tools for rebuilding the pastures. Even the saloon owner, usually too busy with the bar's affairs, showed up with food and drink for the workers. The fire had caused devastation, but Emma's courage had ignited something in the community, sparking an incredible outpouring of support. It was early one morning when Emma and Cartwright stood at the edge of the ranch, watching as the town came together to help restore what had been lost. The sight was overwhelming, a mixture of neighbors, farmers, laborers, and townsfolk all working side by side. The rhythmic sound of hammers and the clatter of wagons filled the air as the fence posts went up, and the fields that had been scorched began to see signs of life again. Emma's heart swelled with pride and gratitude, and for the first time, she understood what it truly meant to be part of something bigger than herself. This was no longer just Cartwright's ranch. This was the entire town's future. They were all invested in it now, and it was as though the fire had done more than just burn the land. It had brought out the best in everyone. As the workers continued their labor, Emma felt a deep sense of connection to the community. In the past, she had always been the orphan who worked for her keep, someone who was accepted but never truly seen. Now it was different. The townspeople were no longer looking at her with pity, but with admiration. They saw her as an equal, someone who had proved herself through her bravery. Emma's heart ached with emotion as she realized just how much she had changed. She was no longer the scared little girl who had come to the ranch, uncertain of her place in the world. She had found a family, and not just in Cartwright, but in the community that was rallying behind her. As they walked through the camp, where the workers were taking a break, Emma noticed the respectful nods and smiles she received from everyone. It wasn't just the adults. There were children too, looking at her as if she were a hero. The young girl who had once been cast aside was now a symbol of hope and resilience. It was strange, this newfound attention. But Emma couldn't deny the warmth she felt when someone would stop her and offer a word of encouragement. She had earned her place here, not by accident, but through her actions. The love and support she felt from the community were overwhelming, but at the same time, they were a reminder of how far she had come. Cartwright stood next to her, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the scene. He could see the change in Emma too, how the town had embraced her, how the respect for her bravery had transformed her into something she hadn't expected, a leader. He had always seen the potential in her, but now he saw a young woman who had found her purpose. Cartwright glanced over at Emma, a faint smile playing on his lips. Her courage had brought them to this moment, and in turn, it had brought the town together. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of optimism. The ranch would recover, and so would the town, but not because of just one person. They were doing it together. As the work continued, Emma moved from group to group, offering encouragement and helping where she could. It wasn't much, just handing someone a tool or offering a word of praise, but it was enough to keep the momentum going. She marveled at how the town, once fractured and distant, had found strength in unity. She had always thought of herself as an outsider, never truly belonging. But now she understood that belonging wasn't just about being accepted, it was about being needed. The town needed her, and she needed them. Together they were stronger than the sum of their parts. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land that had been so devastated just days before. The cattle were safely moved to new pastures, and the fences were slowly being rebuilt. The scars of the fire would remain, but they were no longer the most significant thing. The fire had changed the land, but it had also changed the people. Emma's bravery had sparked something in the town, a renewed sense of purpose. As the workers packed up for the day, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. They weren't just rebuilding a ranch, they were rebuilding their community. Emma stood in the middle of it all, feeling a sense of pride she had never known before. This was home. As the town began to leave for the night, Emma lingered, her eyes on the horizon. The work was far from finished, but she had learned something invaluable today. She had learned the power of community and the strength that came from working together toward a common goal. Her courage had ignited a spark, but it was the town's collective spirit that had turned that spark into a fire of its own. For the first time in her life, Emma knew she wasn't just a survivor. She was part of something far greater than herself. The town was united, and with that unity they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. As the ranch began to recover from the devastating fire, a sense of calm settled over the land. The pasture, once scorched, had begun to bloom once more, and the cattle grazed peacefully in the new fields. The townspeople, inspired by the efforts of Emma and rancher Cartwright, had not only helped rebuild the land, but had begun to rebuild their sense of community. Deadwood Ridge, once a place of struggle and isolation, now felt like a place of unity. Emma's courage had changed everything, and the town was eager to recognize the young orphan who had saved their livelihoods. It was a turning point, and they had decided that it was time to show her the recognition she truly deserved. The air was thick with anticipation as the town gathered in the square to mark the moment. The gathering was unlike any the town had seen in years. There was a new sense of hope, and it was centered around Emma. Rancher Cartwright stood at the front, his usual stoic demeanor softened by the pride he felt. As the crowd quieted, he stepped forward and cleared his throat, the town's attention now fully on him. "Today," Cartwright began, his voice strong but filled with emotion, "we honor the bravery of a young girl who, in the face of fire and disaster, did what many men couldn't. She saved our cattle, and in doing so, she saved our ranch and our town." The crowd stood still, each person recognizing the weight of the words. Cartwright paused, looking toward Emma, who stood off to the side, her small figure now a symbol of courage. She felt the weight of every eye on her, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt right. Cartwright's voice grew even more serious as he continued, his next words marking a significant shift in Emma's life. I have come to realize that Emma is not just a young worker on this ranch. She is someone who has earned her place here, and I would like to make her my official adoptive daughter." The crowd's murmurs filled the air, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. The proposal was unexpected, but it was also the answer she had been seeking since the day she'd arrived at the ranch. The townspeople watched with bated breath as Emma's eyes welled up with tears. A part of her heart had always felt empty, a part that longed for a sense of belonging, for someone to call her their own. As Cartwright's words sank in, a wave of emotion overwhelmed her. She had never felt more wanted, more loved, and more respected. The town had accepted her, and now Rancher Cartwright was offering her the one thing she had always dreamed of: a family. The crowd stood in silence, waiting for Emma to respond, and in that moment, everything around her seemed to still. As Cartwright stood by her side, Emma found herself unable to speak at first. The tears streamed down her face, but there was no sadness in them, only overwhelming joy and gratitude. The fire, the destruction, and the challenges she had faced had led her to this moment, a moment where she was no longer just the orphan who worked the ranch. She was Emma Cartwright, a name that now held meaning. The town was her family, and Cartwright, the man who had taken her in, was now offering her a future with him. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to contain her emotions. "I would be honored." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets of Deadwood Ridge. As the applause died down, Emma stood beside Cartwright, her heart swelling with a new sense of purpose. The ranch, the land, and the town had come to represent more than just survival. They had come to represent family and belonging. The fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead sparked something greater, a unity that could not be broken. Emma looked out at the crowd, seeing the familiar faces of the people who had helped rebuild the ranch, the men and women who had believed in her from the start. They were no longer just townspeople. They were family, her family. In that moment, the entire town seemed to stand with her. Emma realized that she had found her place, the place where she belonged, the place she had always dreamed of. She had gone from being the orphan to being someone who was needed and valued. No longer a girl living in the shadows, she had stepped into the light as a hero and a daughter. The town of Deadwood Ridge had been forever changed by Emma's bravery, and so had Emma herself. She was not just an orphan anymore, she was a daughter, a hero, and a symbol of hope. As the final moments of the celebration passed, Emma took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. The future was no longer uncertain. It was hers to shape, and she knew she would never be alone again. Cartwright, her adoptive father, stood by her side, a silent promise in his gaze. Together they had overcome the hardest of challenges, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. Deadwood Ridge was her home now, a place where she was wanted and loved, and Emma felt her heart settle, knowing that her journey had come full circle. As the town began to disperse, Emma and Cartwright stood together, the weight of the day settling over them. The journey had been hard, but now it felt like a new beginning, a beginning where Emma was not just an orphan, but someone who had earned her place. In this town, on this land, with these people, she had found a new life, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future. She was no longer an outsider, but a part of something bigger, a part of a family. And for the first time, Emma knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.